Welcome to BWC News. I am Elizabeth. The cost of insuring U.S. government debt against default rose to a new high on May 13, as the U.S. moved closer to the ex-date for a possible debt default. According to S&P data, the one-year credit default swap spread, a market indicator used to measure default risk, widened to 176 basis points, a record high, while the 5-year credit default swap spread also reached its highest level since 2009. A host of economists and Wall Street institutions have said that the U.S. debt ceiling battle could threaten the supremacy of the U.S. dollar, bring long-term scarring effects to the U.S. financial system, which already has a crisis of confidence brought on by the regional banking crisis in the U.S., and create a backlash effect on U.S. Treasuries, the cornerstone of global financial assets. In the early morning of May 4, the Federal Reserve announced its May interest rate resolution, announcing another 25 basis point rate hike. Global investors generally speculate that this may be the last rate hike for the current round of U.S. dollars. Since the U.S. launched its anti-inflation campaign in March last year, the dollar has raised interest rates 10 times in a row, with official rates jumping from 0 to 5.25%, the fastest tightening record in nearly 40 years. According to official data, the dollar money supply indicator, M2, shrank 4% year-over-year in March 23. The last time the dollar was so tightly bankrolled was in the 1930s during the Global Depression. US M2 growth is at an all-time low. See here you understand how much pressure is on the US and global economy at the moment. And at this critical moment when the dollar crisis is about to break out, China will also have the most serious challenge. As the originator of the crisis, the United States is naturally the first to bear the brunt. Previously, we have seen the Silicon Valley Bank, because the value of the U.S. debt holdings fell sharply and collapsed at a loss. On May 1, another U.S. bank, First Republic Bank, declared bankruptcy because of the same problem. Large and medium-sized banks of this size can't withstand the pain of a dollar interest rate increase. There are still 5,000 small banks in the United States. Can they withstand it? And what will the U.S. economy look like once more small banks collapse? Of course, the disastrous consequences of excessive interest rate hikes have already occurred to the U.S. elite. So they have also thought of two ways to draw the trouble out. The first way is to use financial instruments to harvest allies EU, Japan, and South Korea to earn profits. Among them, following the 30% depreciation of the yen in 2022, the world's worst-performing major currency, Japan, known for its deflation in early 2023, ushered in a wave of inflation, with the core CPI rising for 19 consecutive months. Japanese goods, which had not been priced for 20 years, began to increase in price. Japan's neighbor, South Korea, burst its real estate bubble as the US dollar raised interest rates. In the past year, Seoul's housing prices have fallen by 20%, leading to the collapse of South Korea's all-rental business model, which is similar to long-term rental apartments, with landlords going bankrupt and even causing young people to commit suicide. The European Union, which is suffering from the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, is not to mention. In addition, the U.S. elite also planned the CHIP Act and Inflation Act, two industrial bills, the use of financial subsidies and long-arm jurisdiction to attract the EU and Japan and South Korea back to the manufacturing sector, to make up for the weakness of their own economies. However, the harvesting of allies and centrifuges, after all, is not a long-term solution. The United States most want to attract the object of the disaster, or China. So, a series of actions against China began. The United States wants to suppress China is not a day or two, but the past few years of tariff war, technology war, public opinion war, have proved ineffective. Recently, global attention has undoubtedly focused on a high-level dialogue between the two major powers, China and the U.S. On May 10, in Vienna, Austria, Chinese Foreign Minister and State Counselor for International Affairs Wang Yi held a face-to-face meeting with U.S. National Security Advisor Sullivan. The dialogue, which was not publicly announced beforehand, was somewhat abrupt, but it was evidence that both China and the United States are strongly motivated to engage in frank and in-depth exchanges. According to Xinhua, China and the United States had frank, in-depth, substantive and constructive discussions on advancing the U.S.-China relationship to remove obstacles. On the Taiwan issue, Foreign Minister Wang Yi comprehensively elaborated on China's stern position. The two sides also exchanged views on the situation in the Asia-Pacific region, Ukraine, and other international and regional issues of common concern. However, behind this dialogue, which is generally seen as a possible easing of US-China relations, the United States sent inconsistent signals on other fronts. At the same time as the high-level US-China dialogue, U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen claimed at the G7 finance ministers meeting to unite the 7 major industrial countries to counter alleged Chinese economic coercion. This parallel between apparent dialogue and behind-the-scenes containment undoubtedly raises deep doubts about the U.S.'s true intentions. Historically, the United States has pursued a complex and subtle strategy toward China, trying to both hunt for economic benefits through dialogue and cooperation and to impede China's progress in various ways. This parallel between dialogue and containment is another example of this complex strategy. If the U.S. cannot pass on the crisis through the dollar as a tool, it will have to bear the consequences of the crisis itself. With China's push, France and China completed the first LNG trade in yuan on March 28, opening a window for Europe to de-dollarize. On March 29, Brazil announced an agreement with China to settle trade between the two countries using local currency. In addition, a meeting of ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors in Indonesia also made de-dollarization a top issue. At the meeting, Malaysia then proposed to introduce a gold-backed Pan-Asian currency among Southeast Asian countries to replace the US dollar. The explanation given by Singapore's former foreign minister for this phenomenon was that the dollar is a curse on all of China, and if you instrumentalize the international financial system, there will be more alternatives to replace it, and the dollar will lose its edge. In the Middle East, on March 31, the Saudi Central Bank released a report saying it is planning to establish a digital currency cross-border settlement system anchored in gold to replace the past oil settlement system anchored in dollars. From the first Fed rate hike in March 2022 to the last one today, it has been a long time since China and the US have had their way with each other. In perhaps less than 6 months, we will witness a split between the winners and losers between China and the United States. Whether the U.S. succeeds in transferring the crisis through the U.S. dollar, or China prevents the U.S. from transferring the crisis through de-dollarization, who will get the final victory is still undecided. At the G7 finance ministers meeting, U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen claimed to work with the 7 major industrial nations to counter the so-called Chinese economic threat, while China took a tough stance against Western pressure and provocations on economic and Taiwan issues. While the US-China dialogue has opened up new possibilities for US-China relations, it does not mean that the relationship has become any less complex or sensitive. On the contrary, the US-China relationship is likely to face greater challenges as the United States exerts dual diplomatic and economic pressure on China.